Hi, I'm Bob Herbert. Welcome to OpEd.tv. We lost one of America's greatest journalists last June when Bill Moyers died. He was 91 years old, and he left a legacy on this nation's politics, government, and news reporting that was flat out astonishing. His influence was immense, and I was one of the people who benefited over many years from his wisdom and unfailing generosity. Another journalist who benefited from a long and productive association with Moyers is my guest, Eric Alterman, an historian, former media columnist for The Nation magazine, and a distinguished English and journalism professor at CUNY's Brooklyn College. We'll discuss Moyers' long career and his impact on our careers. Eric, welcome. Nice to see you.
It's a pleasure to be here to talk about Bill.
You did a remarkable profile of Moyers in which you pointed out that he actually had 3 careers and excelled at all of them. So maybe we'll start there. What were his 3 careers?
Well, he had, at an unbelievably young age, a very influential political career. I believe Bill might still be the youngest person ever to be approved by the Senate.
Right. And I think he is.
Yes, he certainly was at the time.
Yeah.
So he helped invent, initially, he was an aide to Lyndon Johnson as a very young man. And he helped create the Peace Corps. Mm-hmm. And later he helped create PBS, by the way. And then he became president's press secretary. And he had, in his 20s, and he had this tortured father-son relationship with Johnson, where he pushed the president on civil rights and did a really good job on that. But he had to make a lot of compromises. And he tried to push the president to withdraw from Vietnam, or at least not expand Vietnam. And he completely failed at that. And I think the his failure to have any success with Johnson is what eventually led him to leave government.
I was part of an administration, the Johnson administration. I was press secretary for the last 2 years of my stay there, that closed the wagons around ourselves in response to Vietnam. The truth didn't get in very easily. And finally, when it didn't get in, we all sort of shared the same view of the world, the same view of Vietnam. And as a consequence of that terrible thing to happen, an administration failed. Lyndon Johnson died, a tragic president, and the country and the Vietnamese went through a horrible thing. Why? Because the contrarian voices, the alternative view of reality, never really penetrated to the consciousness of the decision makers.
There was a man in the White House named George Ball.
Yep.
His job was to be the dissident on Vietnam in the State Department. And he would write memos that today look incredibly prophetic about Vietnam, also about Israel. And he would give them to the Secretary of State or to George Bundy, the National Security Advisor, and they would die on their desks.
Right.
And Bill would steal them from the desks and put them on the president's.
Wow.
And if Lyndon Johnson had listened to those memos, then the world would be a better place.
Among other things, he was one of the architects of Johnson's Great Society programs. You know, he was crucial to the creation of the Peace Corps.
Yeah.
So young. I mean, it was insane. I mean, and then of course we get to his journalism. Talk a little bit about his approach to journalism. What made him so special? What was unique about his approach to journalism? Because there have been a lot of good journalists.
Yeah, well, when Bill left the White House, the country, particularly the sort of sophisticated people, had turned against the war. And he never publicly denounced Johnson, but people understood why he had left. And he had incredible opportunities at the time that he was being offered. And the one he chose was to be publisher of Newsday.
Right.
I mean, he always upheld the rules of journalism, kind of passé now, but even though he hadn't been a journalist before, he understood why they were important. But he also profoundly sought to change the content. And the idea, the old cliche about speaking truth to power, afflicting the comfortable and comforting the afflicted. That was something Bill took very seriously. And so he fought with the owner of Newsday. But he changed the newspaper quite a bit in Long Island, which is, not a terribly progressive area then or now. And then he moved on to network news, CBS News, where he fought like hell at CBS News and did some of the best network journalism ever done. I would put Bill's career, both if you add up PBS and CBS and later NBC, against any journalist in television history, including the sainted Edward R. Murrow, I think.
I would agree with that.
Yeah. He did two things that distinguished him. One was he fought for a point of view that was never, or nowhere else was heard on television news, but he also did stories that no one else would touch. And he fought like hell, and he made everyone around him crazy, in part because he would compromise, but also because he wouldn't compromise the quality. I mean, I once sat with him in the control room before he was doing a show, before the show was about to air, and he was examining every single little detail and re-airing, redoing things that I didn't notice, and I was there to notice them. That was my job. So I just give you one, for instance, that stands out today. I mean, I could give you many. We could do the whole show about things that Bill did that no one else did. But his special on the black family that he did for CBS, about the disappearing black family, about the lack of fathers in black ghettos, and what it was doing to the young people who grew up in those communities, in part because integration had pulled the economically successful black people out of what had previously been a functioning ecosystem in the ghetto.
There are successful, strong black families in America, families that affirm parental authority and the values of discipline, work, and achievement, but not many live around here. Still, not every girl in the inner city ends up a teenage mother. Not every young man goes into crime. There are people who have stayed here to fight for these kids. They're outnumbered by the con artists and pushers. It's not an even match, but they stand for morality and authority and give some of these kids a bracing dose of unsentimental love.
And that program, nobody wanted that program. I mean, maybe some right-wingers wanted that program because they had been arguing that the problem is culture, not money, but Bill was on the side of the people who wanted to invest more money in schools.
And those were the kinds of programs that even the newspapers and even the so-called liberal newspapers were not doing.
Exactly. Nobody wanted the blowback that was certain to occur from every direction simultaneously. Even the right-wingers would say he didn't go far enough, or he was too understanding of things like what the culture of poverty. Anyway, he did this incredible program that there's never been anything like it before or since. And I think it really had an important effect. Scholars who were writing about this began to be listened to in a way they hadn't been. And maybe it didn't work out so well. Ronald Reagan, took us backwards. But what Bill did was he showed us what journalism and in a larger sense culture could accomplish. Because another thing he did was culture. He did a show just with interviewing intellectuals. He did a show. He did religion in a way it hasn't been done ever. He was a ordained minister.
One of the things that you're touching on is how broad the definition of news should be. We act like the only thing that's news are the press releases that are coming out of the White House or coming out of City Hall or something like that, or things that the politicians are saying or doing, when in fact we live in this wide world and there's so much of significance. And Moyers touched on a tremendous amount of that.
At PBS.
Yep.
Late in his television career, he was hired by NBC to do what he had done at CBS, to give commentary. And they didn't like his commentary, of course. But I was hired in 1996 to the very first day that MSNBC went on the air. And the idea of MSNBC at the time was we've got 24 hours now.
Right.
We've got this big staff that we're paying
Yep.
for already. Let's set them loose and do the things that there's no time
Because they have all the resources that
network news.
NBC had.
Right.
Yeah.
And I was really looking forward to Bill, and not just Bill, but particularly to Bill, to use that time. And what did MSNBC do? They just did the same damn story over and over again for 24 hours. They were so terrified. I would be on the air at MSNBC. I was a quote-unquote friend to talk about the news. And the head of NBC, MSNBC, who later became the head of all of NBC, he would say, we're losing viewers, switch the topic.
Was that Andy Lack?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Andy Lack, who had worked for Bill.
Yeah.
And who loved Bill and said the best work he ever did was for Bill. But Andy Lack knew what his job was at MSNBC, and it wasn't to give Bill the time
Right.
he needed to do these sensitive stories.
Well, I think it's interesting that you mentioned how meticulous Moyers was. He was a taskmaster. But in your profile, you mentioned the extraordinary number of people who loved working with Bill. Many would say that it was the best professional experience of their lives. I found the same thing. I was doing things with Bill and met a lot of the people who had worked with him over the years. They just stayed with him,
Yep.
since forever. But they might have to work long hours or work on weekends, work till 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, or Moyers would change his mind on stuff.
And make a lot less money than they
And make a lot less money. So give us a little insight into why, in a situation that was pretty difficult, in which a lot of people might hate working under those conditions, why so many people thought it was the best working situation of their lives.
Well, I'll tell you, I was assigned a piece by the Washington Post magazine in 1991 about Bill. And I turned it in, and the editor said, we can't run this, it's too complimentary. It's too nice,
Right.
you're too enthralled by the guy. So he said, but there's great material here because Bill is a great talker. So everyone I interviewed had worked with him at CBS rather than at PBS. And they all were like, oh man, I'll never have another experience like that again. He was so difficult, but I'm so proud of what we accomplished. He was not a flawless person, Bill.
Right. Sometimes it was difficult.
But people knew his flaws, and they said, no problem.
Right.
I get it. I'm never going to have a better situation
Yep.
than this.
Yep. You mentioned that one of the things that you and he shared an obsession with the right-wing takeover of so much of news business over the past, well, now it's quite a few years. Talk about that a little bit. Talk about the impact of this right-wing takeover and how it happened. I mean, it happened before our eyes, and it should not have been permitted, but go ahead.
Well, the key to the right-wing takeover of the news business is, again, back in 1996, Fox News was founded, and it was profitable.
Right.
No other news is profitable. As CBS News lost money. I mean, they did it because they had to. That was part of the deal of them getting free airwaves.
Yeah, in the beginning, it wasn't even supposed to be profitable.
Yeah. Well, I don't
Or it
think
wasn't
I don't think
expected to be
I don't think it's
possible.
profitable today.
Right.
But Murdoch made money at Fox News because it was so cheaply done, and because they had this audience that wanted it, and they didn't anyway, for whatever reason. And the news business, because of the internet, which began around the same time, lost more and more of its advertisers. Began around then, and yet here was a guy who could make money and hire people. And what was he doing? He was doing two things: right-wing ideology and tabloid news.
Yeah, right.
The two things that we don't need the news for. I mean, you can, if you want to buy a right-wing magazine or watch a right-wing show, fine, go do it. But that's not where the news business should be. So what happened is there used to be like a liberal news media, a centrist establishment news media, and Bill was kind of the shuttle between these two. And then a right-wing media, which was rather small. And the liberal media, the centrist establishment media, came to be understood as the liberal media. And the
Right.
liberal media basically disappeared. Your column,
Right.
The Nation,
Yep.
not much else. Tony Lewis, when he had
Yep.
a column. And so the 50-yard line of ideology moved all the way towards Fox and even CBS and NBC and ABC saw that that's where the money was. And the other thing that happened was that CBS, when Murrow was at CBS, it had one owner who could decide what to do, and he cared about his honor, he cared about his creation.
Right.
But it became a corporate business where the very same people who had been Murrow's boys working for Murrow, when they started working for 60 Minutes, they had to do what the corporation wanted, and were killing the same kinds of stories that Murrow was running. And Bill was still doing these stories, but on PBS, not on CBS. So Bill had this weird charisma and presence, and carried himself in such a way that he was sort of a throwback to the days of Walter Cronkite.
Yep.
And so they wanted him, but they didn't want him to be what he actually was.
They didn't want the real him, or they didn't want all of him.
Right. And that they didn't get. You couldn't get just the parts.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah. So he would occasionally appear on network news for a long time on CBS, and then they would pair him with a right winger, and on NBC ultimately. But he really, even on PBS, they didn't want him after a while. But what he did with PBS was he raised his own money. He had a real talent for raising money. Mutual of Omaha, I believe, if I recall correctly.
Yep.
And he would raise tens of millions of dollars to do his.
He had a vast array of talents. You know, we talked about his political career. You know, and he would schmooze all the people on Capitol Hill, you know, to help get this Peace Corps established and stuff. Now you're talking about his ability to raise money, you know, and then the journalism. It's incredible.
Right, but he was, I mean, Ken Burns raises a lot of money, but Ken Burns, he does good work, but it doesn't offend anyone.
It doesn't offend anyone, and he also didn't have the kind of political career that Bill Moyers.
Yeah, I mean, but Bill
had.
raised money for things that are really hard to raise money for.
Oh, absolutely.
That's my point here.
I agree. So, so now let's look at his third major career, and that was philanthropy.
Yeah.
Talk about that a little bit.
Well, these people, the Schumans, had $60 million that they had inherited from
General Motors, I think.
Yeah, if you say so, I forget. And they watched Bill on television, and they came up to Bill and said, "We want you to take care of our $60 million." They didn't know him. They just thought, "Here's a man we respect and admire." So Bill had this foundation that later he eventually became named the Schuman Center for Media and Democracy.
Right. I was a board member. I was a board member of that foundation.
I was never invited to be a board member. I was a little annoyed by that. But I was funded by it on occasion. And first of all, I want to point out that even though Bill and I were friends and we would have dinner with relative frequency, I never got any money that didn't go through the board. Like everything was on the up and up. And I was turned down on occasion. But my career, eventually I got this very nice, and I'm very proud of it, my distinguished professorship at Brooklyn College. But in the years before that, Bill made my career possible. Mm-hmm. He made it possible for me to do the work that eventually landed me, made it possible for me to be recognized for whatever talent I have. And he did that for a lot of people.
He did it for me. I remember when I did a book several years ago, and he and I were talking about the book, and it required a lot of travel around the country. And he raised financing to take care of travel expenses and hotels.
And I bet you it wasn't too bad either.
I mean, that's what he did.
Yeah.
But on a much larger scale, he did things, you know, for people in journalism, for people in taking care of the environment.
Well, he had three causes. They were journalism that wouldn't otherwise get published.
Yep.
There was money in politics, and there was the environment. And everything fell in one of those categories. And he gave away all the money, all 60 million plus the interest that
was the point,
yeah. As Bill got older, he actually passed me. When we met, I met him in Managua, Nicaragua, and I was a big lefty, and he was Mr. Establishment guy. And we crossed. He became much more radical than I became. Bill was a member of the establishment when I met him. And I was banging on the establishment's head. I thought the way to change America was to make a better establishment, to try and either educate them or embarrass them into doing a better job, because regular people couldn't do very much. And Bill, at some point, I can't tell you that he just gave up on the establishment and said, we need a movement of people. And that's who I'm going to speak to. And Bill and I think, if I might be pretentious enough to say so, we ended up doing the same thing, albeit he did it on a much, much bigger scale than I ever could, which was not to actually change all that much, but to comfort people in showing them that what they believed was fine, that people had a feeling that things were amiss and they didn't understand why, and Bill would give them the facts and say, yes, your understanding of the world, even though you're not seeing it reflected in the news, is accurate, and here's the evidence for it. And nothing made Bill happier than the mail he would get from people thanking him for telling them that they weren't crazy.
I have a little bit of a different view of what constitutes success in journalism, as opposed to, for example, with Moyers when he was in government. In government, you want to get things passed, you want to get things to happen, et cetera. In journalism, you'd like to have the kind of impact that would change things for the better, obviously, you know. But I don't think that's a requirement. I think what journalism has to do is get everything on the record and get it in context and in some depth, so that people who are seriously interested, people like you, people like me, but people in government, et cetera, have access to what's real about the world that we're living in. Moyers was profoundly successful in that way. And in fact, I always thought that as terrific a commentator as Moyers was, I always thought that his documentary and other documentaries and other longer work was more important, because he got into the depth of things that other journalists and even other writers, historians, and essayists and that sort of thing didn't get to. That information is there, available to us. Things can still change. We want to get to a better period than the one that we're in, than the one that we're in now. You know, so journalists can't just change the world with a piece. They can have an impact, but it's important to get the information on the record.
Sure, I'm a historian. I mean, I think of myself as a historian more than I think of myself as a journalist, even though I'm better known for my journalism, such as it is. But I'll tell you, when I met Bill, he was, as I recall, a long time ago, in the late 80s, in Managua. He was doing a long series on the right-wing church in Latin America,
right,
and how it was transforming Latin America. He also, just off the top of my head, he did long pieces on what was going on in El Salvador and Nicaragua and the United States involvement that was being lied about. He did a piece about the media in Iraq. He did a very long special on the passage of NAFTA and the GATT treaty later on. And there's an awful lot, I'm willing to stand up and on this, I'm willing to stand on this point as a historian, there's an awful lot in each of those that we would not know otherwise.
Exactly.
That you can't find anywhere else. And he did it on TV, which is
so hard, so difficult to do.
It's
on
hard,
television.
and it's bigger than print, you know?
Yep.
It's reaching
Exactly.
more people. So he's threading this needle of raising money from somewhat conservative people and foundations, depending on how you define the term, and really high production values, so they're expensive shows, and then getting PBS, which is always nervous about its funding because it gets some from the government, as we see today. They're right to be nervous, and doing really good work and saying things that people don't necessarily want to hear. There was very little opposition to NAFTA and GATT at the time that Bill did these shows, except from unions, and unions are far less powerful than they ever were. So
I remember criticizing NAFTA. This was soon after I went to the Times, and I wrote columns criticizing the deep flaws in NAFTA, and was really attacked. People say, "Oh, he doesn't understand anything about the economy."
That was the thing. As with the war in Iraq, NAFTA was like, "Are you a sophisticated person or not?"
Right.
And the word, the journalism critic at NYU, Jay Rosen, came up with the term savvy. Journalists want to appear savvy. They don't get paid very much, but they want to be respected and admired for how smart they are, and that they get it. There's only one it. Bill didn't get it. Bill went deeper than whatever it was to show you what was really going on. And I think your friend Tony Lewis was one of those NAFTA people.
Tony was.
Yeah, but NAFTA. Go back and look at his NAFTA columns.
Right.
Anyway, I'm just saying. This is if you're going deeper and harder than Tony Lewis on something, you're really going deep.
I agree. I have more questions and more comments, but we've run out of time.
See, I told you we needed 3.
No, you're right. Eric Alterman has been our guest. Eric, thank you so much for coming in to talk
a
about
pleasure
Bill
to be
Moyers.
here.
Right.
And I think this show, in some ways, was a tribute to Bill in how we did it, not just the words themselves.
Fantastic.
Thank you.
So I'm Bob Herbert. Thank you for watching, and we will see you next time. Take care. CUNY TV now has an app. Downloading the CUNY TV app lets you join us anytime from anywhere.